Since we made some adorable baby Phantumps last month, today we're going to be making this tall, dark, and handsome Trevenant daddy for them. Since this guy is so big and detailed, I want to make sure I don't mess up his dimensions. So off camera, I sketched him in a T-pose, while my husband worked out all his scaled dimensions for me. Thank you, honey. I start off with some armature wire and black clay, which will serve as the inner arm tube of my Trevenant. Using my crappiest paintbrush, I coat my armature wire in clay glue so that it hopefully grips onto the black clay better during baking. For the torso spine of my Trevenant, I do a similar process but with some foil filling rather than armature wire. And I realize I need a little bit more foil so that I don't waste a bunch of black clay unnecessarily. I very roughly roll out my black clay and trim it to the right size and shape to be able to fully wrap it around my foil core. I add some mineral oil to smooth it out and make it look less bathroom organic and a little more forest organic. After baking the black chassis, I get started on my Trevenant's head. For this first attempt, I thought I'd try trimming out his little teeth before baking, but I quickly realized that's not the cleanest way to do it. So I remove and re-roll that same piece of raw clay, wrap it around the top of the black pillar, and carve some guidelines for his eye socket visor thing, and add some wood texture to the head before baking. Then I pencil in some guidelines for where his teeth will be, and I use my X-Acto knife to carefully cut them out. No, in. It's definitely in. Since I worry about destroying the headpiece when carving out his eye window, I reinforce it with some aluminum foil, and then carefully trim it out and clean up the cut edges. For his upper arm and forearm wood armor pieces, I use these circle cutters as my molds. Again, I start with a clay sheet wrapped around the circle cutter, texture it, and flare out the sides before baking. Lastly, I trim his arm spikes, teeth, before moving on to his forearm trunk. For perfectly sound reasons I seem to have forgotten, I decide to use a broken paintbrush handle for this. And since I want it to be more cone-shaped, I add another narrow sheet of clay where it will connect to the hand, and I blend it in with my finger, texture it, and bake it. Then, pro tip, I leave it in the oven overnight after baking it, so that it can cool down so slowly that it becomes impossible to remove from the paintbrush. Ultimately, deciding I'd rather continue my work on the Trevenant instead of starting over on a new sculpture involving a broken paintbrush handle though, I toss it back in the oven for 5 minutes in the desperate hope of making the clay a bit more flexible. And it worked! All part of the master plan. After trying to fit the upper and forearm wood chunks onto his arm, I realized how uncalibrated my imaginary measuring tape is, as neither of them fit. Like, not even close. But rather than trying to carefully trim the insides of the wood pieces to be larger, I decided to thin out the black arms instead. And now they both fit. Using the same process you saw with his helmet, I make his torso and waist shells. I also realized after flaring out his chest, wait, are they still called teeth when they're not even an actual part of your body, but just the wood surrounding you? Well, I realized after flaring out his torso dentures that I needed to remake his head. So here's the final head with the top triangle things properly flared out. After giving his hips some similar dental work, it's time to make this daddy thick, with another clay sheet blended in and textured. And some more thickening to try to triangulify his lower body. And because I wouldn't want his hips to lie, I add some final wood texturing to blend it all in a bit better with the 2 previous layers beneath. For my Trevenant's legs, I'm gonna try out a new to me cosplay line called Cosplay Doll. It's supposed to be more flexible than regular cosplay, so it should be my best option to avoid cracks from forming in the legs after I pose them a bunch later. While we do that, let's look at Trevenant's lore, and hope it's better than Phantumps. Alright, so Trevenant was first introduced in the 6th Pokémon generation. His body is actually just the black parts seen in the gaps of the tree he's inside of. Good to know. And it says here, they can control trees at will to trap people who harm the forest, so they can never leave. Okay. And it's kind to the Pokemon that reside in its body? Wait, this thing itself is inside a tree, and there are Pokemon inside this thing? Where? Okay, hopefully that's been clarified a bit. in the more recent Pokédex entries. Trevenant is very kind to Pokémon living in the forest. It doesn't even care if these Pokémon take up residence in the greenery on its head. Oh, they live in his leaves. Okay, I'm comfortable again. Where were we? Ah, right. With my brown clay conditioned, it's time to drill some leg holes into my boy Trev here. Not at all afraid of being trapped in a forest forever after this, I use my X-Acto knife for both maximal convenience and mess. Similar to his arms, I want his legs to be somewhat poseable, so I start with some armature wire that I double up by twisting it, and then drill a deeper hole into his body to snugly fit the wire into. 5 more twists, drills, and stabs later, we now have a not at all creepy, 6-legged bionic woodland monster daddy in the making. Next, I add some gray clay to his bottom to make it more pointy, moisturize the booty, and give it the full tree texture massage it deserves after all that. Once that's done baking, I fill his leg holes with some clay glue and some brown clay and attach his leg bones on or in. And now it's time to put some meat on those cyber tree bones. I start by wrapping a long sheet of brown clay around the armature wire, and I add another smaller piece around the base of the leg to thicken it up. I blend it in with my silicone pointy tool and my metal sculpting tool. And as always, I finish it off with some wood texturing before popping it in the oven. As is tradition, I decided to try actually comparing my result to my subject matter only after baking everything for the millionth time. And sure enough, the leg was still too thin. So I repeated the thickening process once more. Managing to barely fit the Trevenant in my tiny oven now, I'm relieved to report that I managed to bake all the legs without a single one cracking. With our Trevenant officially in its virus phase, it's time to decide how many things I want to permanently glue in place and regret later. So I start with his torso and slap some clay glue and gray clay onto it to hopefully adhere it to the black insides. And I rig this little armature wire to hold it in place while it bakes in the oven. And the torso didn't crack after baking. I just need to clean up this little dent made by the armature wire and fix up this backside of the torso that's missing 2 points. Just kidding, I don't have the dopamine for that just yet. Instead, I'll add Trev's horns because that sounds way more fun and rewarding for some reason. This process is essentially the same as when I made my Phantumps horns. We start off with a cone of clay that we glue to the head, blend it in, and then curve it to its final shape. Beautiful. After doing that for both sides and for his center uni horn, I move on to permanently adhering his upper arms to their black noodle armature wires. Then I give his forearms their own little horns, squee in cuteness at the result, and then I race to repair my Trevenant's back while the optimism is fresh and flowing. Full transparency here though, I recently sold my soul in exchange for the luck needed to pull this insane pack in Pokemon Pocket without a single dollar invested. So karma ensured 2 more of Trev's Jaggies would break while baking his head horns, and that I would spill my drink all over my mat while recording this. But still high on my virtual card hype, I was thankfully able to will myself into fixing everything up and clay gluing Humpty Trevenanty back together again in no time. And what good timing, because it turns out this was just the adversity Trevenant would need to finally go Super Saiyan, starting with the base of his glorious spiky leaf hair. Little known fact, all Saiyans are born with a ball of foil on their head that their hair ultimately gets wrapped around and molded onto. Fashion forward as he is, Trev also gets matching bushes on his wrists too, with a similar bulbous green base that gets baked for a few minutes as always. Now begins the tedious but rewarding, so rewarding, process of applying his leaves on, one at a time. This is a good time to mention that one of the important and time-devouring steps not shown in these videos is me deciding what order to make and bake everything in, when to permanently glue which things together, and which parts shouldn't be permanently glued together at all. Literally half of this video would be me silently staring into Trevenant's eyes, or eye, trying to deduce what to do next or not do next, for several minutes at a time between each and every major step, which turns out to be as fun to watch as it is to do. Anyway, it's giant woody palm time. I start with a little blocky shape and add the claw divots in with a large ballpoint tool. After baking the palm, I get started on the talons or claws maybe, which start off as thick cones that I carefully mold to a sharp curved point. Since I want the top of his hand to be flush with the fingers, I trim it down with an X-Acto knife, and then reapply the wood grain lines the best I can using one of my sanding tools. Next, I make a base for his awesome green afro, so that I have something to hold on to while I adhere the leaves. A few minutes of inner monologue later, I decide not to add any glue here, since I might be removing this piece completely after finishing the leaves on his head. And just like with his arm bushes, I add the leaves on one by one, starting with the bottommost ring of leaves and working my way up to the tippy toppest leaf. His hands then get holes drilled into the wrists, since it's finally time to permanently adhere them to their arms. So here we are at the scariest step, drilling holes into his torso for his arms to be glued into. But it's fine, we have all the time and patience in the world to get this right. And they don't fit. Unwilling to try and fail by hand again, I pull out a Dremel for the first time in a project that relied heavily on drilling holes. Before you ask, I totally didn't almost drill all the way through to my finger either, so that's good. And more importantly, both arms fit. Beautiful. And what better way to celebrate having 10 holeless fingers still than a tasty home-cooked meal? After gluing his arms into their respective armholes, it's time to add the little leaf accents to my Trevenant, starting with his shoulder leaves. Then I coat these baby leaves in some more clay adhesive to make them look smoother and to hold them in place better, so that I don't rip them off on accident later. And since I realize his pointy woodland diaper should protrude a bit more, I add some more clay to it and texture it with my wire texturing brush. Now before I start painting this guy, I want to make sure I'm happy with all the wood texture details on him. So I clean up some of the rougher parts by sanding them a bit with this metal file. I also fixed this arm splinter that broke, as well as this shoulder where the clay cracked all the way through, exposing the armature wire. I tried filling that up with some clay glue and some black clay, but that didn't work, which you can see here after I baked it. But it did cause another crack to form in this leg right here. So that's my cue to move on before I fix him into tiny irreparable pieces. Honestly though, I'm surprised more of him didn't split, crack, or break with how many bakings I gave him and how many times I bent his arms and legs, both before and after bakings. Next up is coating his woodsy parts with a layer of dark brown paint, followed by a finer brushing of dark brown detailing around his leaves. This part is kind of unnecessary because the next step is aggressively dry brushing everything brown, but I hadn't stared long enough into the void to realize that at the time. Oh well. The final aggressive dry brushing is with this honey brown color, but it turns out this wasn't so much dry brushing as it was brushing, so I had to sand away some of it afterwards. Next, I coat all the wooden parts with some watered down dark brown paint to bring out the texture details and smooth out my not so dry brushing a bit. And for some of the black components that got dry brushed light brown, I paint over them with some black acrylic paint. Then I do the same, but in green, for the leaves. And I paint his giant red iris, with a large ballpoint tool, and his pink pupil, I guess, with a smaller ballpoint tool. And finally, after a layer of matte varnish and fresh carpal tunnel damage, it's time for our photo shoot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.